So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stefano Montaldo. I teach European Union law at the University of Turin. I'm along with my colleague Virginia Paslacqua, I'm hosting this meeting for the University of Turin. But please beware the fact that this is a very much collective effort, because as Daniela Vitiello will explain into greater detail, this meeting is the kickoff of a research project funded by the Italian Ministry of University and Research, which involves 3 units, namely Torino, Bologna, and the University of Tuscia as a leading, the latter is the leading unit. So also this kickoff is a collective effort for which I really have to say a big thank you to the colleagues involved in the project, and also, of course, to our distinguished speakers. Just 2 words on the idea behind this meeting, because when we were considering how to approach the kickoff of our project, we had 2 alternatives. On the one hand, the very, so to say, project management meeting, so a practical meeting full of financial details and deadlines and schedules. The other option was to share views and thoughts, and also collect ideas and forward-looking ideas on the core challenges which our project will have to face. Community sponsorship is increasingly at the core of EU, and I would also say even beyond the EU debates. In Europe, it is particularly compelling and topical because of the upcoming adoption of the Pact on Migration, and because of other institutional initiatives that are ongoing at the EU level. So we are aware that this project is on the one hand very timely somehow, but also very challenging for us as research units. So this was why we are particularly grateful to our speakers, because they accepted the challenge of providing us some food for thought for our project, and also for the research and institutional activities of the other participants involved in this meeting. So this is how I would urge all the participants to approach these 100 and something together. On a very practical note, I need to update you on 2 important aspects. First of all, unfortunately, one of the speakers, in particular, Dr. Leila Giannetto, will not be able to join us because of a last-minute personal issue. Flus in these days are hitting quite hard, also within our project teams, unfortunately. So she regrets for not being able to be with us, but I need to say a big thank to Andrea Petrakin, who proposed himself for, let's say, expanding his presentation also to cover some of the elements which Leila would have addressed. So thank you very much for this. Secondly, since we saved 20 minutes, I think we can really benefit from this opportunity to engage in with the speakers, with the questions, to share thoughts, comments. So we will organize the meeting as follows. First of all, Daniela Vitiello will outline the main features of the project. Then we will go straight to Sara Bortoletti from the European Commission. I will introduce her to all of you later, and Andrea Petrakin from the University of Turin. After their presentations, we'll have a question and answer session, also to allow Petra, who will provide us with some concluding remarks, to have the time to collect ideas and exchanges of views from the audience, and to conclude. Also, after Petra's conclusions, I think we'll have time enough for further questions in case of there will be any. Okay, so this is it. For those of you who want to intervene, you have two options. The first one, the easiest probably, is to type on the little hand you can find at the bottom of the page, and to reserve your intervention orally. You are all allowed to unmute yourself, and in case anything doesn't work, I can do it for you. Secondly, you can type your questions or comment in chat, and I will organize the transmission to the speakers. Okay. So without any further ado, I think we can start with our first speaker. She's Daniela Vitiello, who is professor of European Union Law at the University of Tuscia. But first and foremost, to our purposes today, she is the principal investigator of the COSME project. So, Daniela, please, the floor is yours for 7 minutes and 30 seconds.
Thank you so much, Stefano. And first of all, let me thank the unit of Turin University for hosting this kickoff meeting of our joint project. And let me also thank deeply all the speakers and the audience who joined us for this kickoff. I prepared a short presentation of our project, and I'm trying to display it now. Just a second, because okay, so it should work. Please advise me if there is any problem. Can you see?
Yes, we can.
Screen?
Yes.
Great. So thank you. This is the actual title of our project. As Stefano anticipated, this is a research project of national interest. It's called PRIN, and we decided to work on a very intriguing issue when we started projecting with Stefano and Marco Borracetti of the University of Bologna. And we decided to give a title which is a little bit long, and it's a clear example of the complexity we wanted to delve into. And the title is Towards a European Model of Community Sponsorship for Refugees, Access, Reception and Integration. Then, of course, when we started to, when we were informed about the funding by the Italian Ministry of the university, we decided to streamline a little bit the approach and also to expand the scope, the scope of the project in order to encompass also migrants. And that's why we use this acronym, Community Sponsorship for Migrants in Europe. Migrants to be intended as a very general word, so we would like to extend the scope of the project also to refugees, of course. And the project has a main goal, which is to provide legal appraisal of a European model of community sponsorship in light of the interest by European Union institution in situating a European way to community sponsorship, also in perspective of our practices which have developed worldwide. And when defining the main elements of this project, we first of all had to face a definition challenge, because of course community sponsorship can be intended as a complementary pathway, but also as a tool to enhance many complementary pathways. And therefore, one of the backbones of the project is to study this definitional issue from a legal and theoretical perspective. Then the other element we put into the project is the fragmentation challenge, and therefore we embraced a policy-oriented perspective when studying and providing an analysis of the policy transfer challenge from one local or national dimension and jurisdiction to other proximate dimensions and jurisdictions. Last but not the least, the project has an implementation and operational focus. And this is very important for us because the research questions we want to answer are not only related to the role and scope of community sponsorship within the framework of European Union policies, but the research questions are also related to the impact, the potential impact of community sponsorship on active participation of migrants, refugees at the local level and social cohesion of host communities. So for all those reasons, we identified a number of guiding principles, which are, of course, steering our analysis. And therefore, we will cut all the topics and all the aspects to be analyzed through, a permanent focus on the public interest and the needs of host communities, respect for fundamental rights, migrants and refugees, in the perspective of enhancing their active participation and the issue of sustainability. Consortium, as Stefano said, is made of 3 research units belonging to our 3 universities. So the University of Turin, the University of Bologna, and the University of Tuscia. All research units are very interdisciplinary in the sense that there are lawyers, but also economists and sociologists and many other skills are included in each unit. This is very important for us because even though the outcomes of the project are mainly in the realm of law and European Union law, we need all those competencies and skills in order to develop the different phases and the different milestones of the project. The case studies we identified to better explore the community sponsorship and the construction of a European model of community sponsorship are the university corridors for refugees, private sponsorship for urban and rural employment, and public-private partnerships for mass displacement. Each research unit is going to explore one of those case studies, and namely the University of Bologna will be in charge of developing the case study on university corridors, and Bologna, of course, has a long experience in this field, and it's a leading institution also at the European level for expanding tertiary education corridors for refugees. Therefore, we are in very good hands. Then the University of Turin will deal with private sponsorship for urban and rural employment, with a focus also on the different perspective of local authorities and the way in which those differences can affect community sponsorship in the end. The unit of Tuscia will be in charge of exploring partially less connected issue, less connected with the traditional understanding of community sponsorship, because we will explore the public-private partnership for mass displacement in light of the outcomes of the response to the Ukrainian crisis. So we will try to understand whether this response and the way in which it enhanced transnational solidarity can be factored into the discourse of community sponsorship or not. It's a very big question mark, and we will try to provide some further understanding on this. This is the consortium. Here you can see a sort of workflow of the project. I'm not going to spend many words on that because you will see it operational on the website of the project very soon. But just to to say that we will start through a mapping and comparing analysis, and then we will move on to the evaluation of implication for policy transfer of the results we have obtained through the mapping. And the last, goal to achieve in our project will be providing an evaluation of policy settings for a European model of community sponsorship. And we are extremely glad to know that the Asylum Agency will soon deliver some guidelines on community sponsorship. They are the results of a long and very participated analysis of the potential for community sponsorship at the European Union level and how to scale up national schemes and national good practice at the European level, which is also one of the endeavors of the European Union institutions. Therefore, we really hope to, dialogue with those results, those guidelines, and also provide our understanding on this. This is the network which is under construction. So at the moment we have scheduled and we have met different partners, external partners, and we really aim to expand the network of this project as much as we can in the next months. I'll stop here, and of course I am available for doubts, questions, and curiosities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Following up on what you were saying, with our speakers, we will try somehow to reflect the three branches, the three main pillars of the project, and in particular, we will start with the, I would say, institutional general one, namely thanks to the contribution from the presentation from Sara Bortoletti from the DG, who is policy officer at the DG Home of the European Commission. We will try to share some thoughts and views on the must-have, the pillars, the real pillars of a potential European way to community sponsorship. So we are particularly grateful to Sara for her very kind availability and for joining us today. She is specifically devoted to community sponsorship as at the European Commission, so she really is the voice on this topic. Sara, please, the floor is yours for 20 minutes as agreed.
Thank you very much, Stefano, also for the kind words. I'll try to share my screen. Oh, okay. Can you confirm that you can see my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. So, as you just mentioned, my name is Sara Bortoletti. I work as a policy officer in the unit specifically dealing with safe pathways to protection, notably resettlement, humanitarian admission, complementary pathways, and community sponsorship. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I look forward to the discussion. During my presentation, I will firstly try to give an introduction to community sponsorship, what we mean when we refer to community sponsorship, and the added value the scheme can have for all those involved. Then I will briefly touch upon the EU Commission efforts in promoting further the initiative across the member states. And I will then focus on what, from my personal perspective, are the key elements that can characterize the EU way of doing community sponsorship. As you mentioned, and I know my colleague Amaury from the EU Agency for Asylum is here with us today, this is without prejudice to the content of the guidelines that are to be published soon. Then I will conclude with what we can expect in the next few months on community sponsorship. So, sorry, here we go. What is community sponsorship? And I know one of the key questions also of the COSME project is about a definition of community sponsorship. For the time being, we do not have such a definition. In the EU, when we refer to community sponsorship, we refer to a very flexible concept. In very simple terms, and I'm sure many of you are already quite familiar with the idea, when we mention community sponsorship, we refer to a group of private citizens. When we speak about traditional community sponsorship, then we see very innovative models with different types of sponsors being, for example, employers or universities, but let's stick to the basics. So private citizens who, with the help of civil society organizations, and of course in close cooperation with local, regional, and national authorities, provide financial, practical, and moral assistance to admit and integrate refugees. Community sponsorship is considered a successful tool to enhance the social inclusion of refugees. And we see community sponsorship as a way to underpin safe and legal pathways to protection, notably resettlement, humanitarian admission, and complementary pathways. We see merit in the scheme, in the community sponsorship initiative, as it has added value for all those involved. First of all, for the refugees. No one integrates to the European Union or to member states, but newcomers integrate into the local society, into the host community. Having a personal connection with members of the local community can easily unlock the integration potential of newcomers. It can be a great tool to provide newcomers with practical information, access to local networks, and a personal connection to the host community. Local communities can benefit as well from community sponsorship schemes, as the scheme can help communities to forge closer link with newcomers and also enhance a positive narrative around refugees welcoming. Ultimately, community sponsorship schemes can have an added value for member states as well, as these initiatives support and complement the reception capacity of member states, with a view to ultimately increasing the number of admission places through safe and legal pathways that member states can provide. In the light of the added value that I just mentioned to all the stakeholders involved, the Commission saw merit and continues to do so in supporting the expansion and the further promotion of community sponsorship models across the member states. The Commission has been doing so in different ways. First of all, providing a policy framework in the 2020 Commission recommendation on legal pathways to protection in the EU. The Commission encouraged the member states to work closely with civil society organizations to put in place or expand community sponsorship schemes. Community sponsorship schemes are also recognized in the Action Plan on Integration and Inclusion as a way for newcomers to directly be in contact with the local communities and foster integration potential. Since 2019, the European Commission has also provided funding to pilot projects. under the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. In 2019, in 2020, and lastly in January 2023, the Commission launched calls for proposals, also focusing on community sponsorship and promoting further this model. In this way, the Commission has provided funding to grassroots organizations who, very much in cooperation with the different authorities and the other stakeholders involved, are building what we call the community of practice and putting the basis, building the basis for the model to grow and building the necessary ecosystem, not only at the local, at the national, but also at the European level. Lastly, in the Commission recommendation published in 2020, the Commission also encouraged member states to contribute to the what is a new approach to community sponsorship with the support of the former EASO, now called EU Agency for Asylum. The EU agency has set up a dedicated working group under the framework of the Resettlement and Humanitarian Admission Network, a working group specifically dedicated to community sponsorship, which provided an opportunity not only to the community sponsorship experts from the member states, but also to other policymakers, international organizations, different stakeholders, grassroots initiatives, civil society organization, and people with lived experience, you name it, to come together, share best practices, discuss the different elements and the building blocks that will feature in the deliverable of this working group, which was already mentioned and are the guidelines on a new approach to community sponsorship. Now, okay. Coming to what I believe are few of the key elements that can contribute and characterize the European Union way of doing community sponsorship. First of all, as you may know, community sponsorship initiatives are fairly recent in the EU member states. In 2015, Italy became the first member state to launch so-called humanitarian corridors, followed then by Belgium and France in 2017. These are schemes in which faith-based and not only civil society organizations come together and support the admission and integration of refugees. Then, since 2018, we see sponsorship schemes being piloted in Ireland, Spain, in the Basque Country, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal as a way to underpin national resettlement program. As you see, there is a variety of models across the member states, and this flexibility and this variety is a key component of what we understand as a new approach to community sponsorship, as the model is flexible, adaptable to the national context, and there is, of course, no one size fits all. However, we still see convergences. Notwithstanding the many differences I just mentioned, all EU community sponsorship schemes are based on a strong partnership between the state, civil society organizations, and private individuals. Of course, this multi-stakeholder approach is based on a clear division of tasks that supports also the management of the expectations of all the different actors involved. This is key so to ensure the sustainability of the program and that all the actors involved, not only the refugees, the sponsors, but also the coordination and the organization involved, have clear tasks and clear priorities for the success of the program. I can bring an example. For example, in Ireland, regional coordination and support with the administrative burden. Ireland is one of the member states where community sponsorship is growing. Private citizens, when they form a sponsor group, are immediately matched with a regional support organization. There are 4 different support organizations in the regions of the country, and there is also a national coordination. These organizations provide trainings and professional administrative support. They accompany sponsor groups and newcomers through their journey. And then sponsorship groups are tasked with sourcing accommodation and fundraising for the refugees. All these requirements are set at the beginning and well discussed with the different support organizations. Another example of management of the expectation, I would say, is Portugal. In Portugal, sponsors, before signing up for the responsibility of sponsoring a refugee, are requested to finalize a training module, which comprises 6 online modules for a total of almost 30 hours. It can look very lengthy, but it's a way to test also the sponsor commitment towards such a responsibility as sponsoring a refugee. Another convergence that I see is, of course, the need for adequate standards and safeguarding measures within community sponsorship schemes. Despite the differences in the national programs, all EU sponsorship schemes must take into account the EU legal framework on asylum and migration, which grants rights to beneficiaries of international protection in terms of access to education, social welfare, healthcare, accommodation, as well as access to integration programs. Of course, sponsors are supporting the integration process of newcomers, but it's ultimately a responsibility of the state authorities for ensuring that essential socioeconomic services and needs are met. Going on, another key element of EU community sponsorship schemes is monitoring and evaluation. It is essential to build well-designed programs and to have feedback loops for continuous improvement, to have a clear monitoring and evaluation culture. And I'm happy to notice that this is increasingly spread around the different organizations and also at the national level. Stakeholders are aware of the importance of monitoring evaluation and are putting efforts into the, developing this culture in order to have an impact assessment of community sponsorship schemes, and also building the design of new programs or redesigning of existing schemes on a knowledge-based and evidence-based. The UAA is leading reflection in a dedicated working group on monitoring and evaluation for resettlement and humanitarian admission programs. Guidelines also on M&E will be published soon, which will also shed light on indicators that can be relevant for community sponsorship. I would like to give you also a few other examples and best practices under EU-funded project. Firstly, the Share Network, a project led by ICMC Europe, and maybe Petra, you can tell us a bit more about this. The network was co-founded by the EU and has published cross-country evaluation and issued policy recommendations on different schemes across the member states. Another example of monitoring and evaluation culture is the CAPS-EU project, in which the Migration Policy Institute has led reflection roundtables and has developed a few indicators specifically for community sponsorship schemes. I, for example, participated in a roundtable at the beginning of September, where the Migration Policy Institute convened different stakeholders in Belgium engaged in community sponsorship from the local authorities, the city of Mechelen and the city of Antwerp, but also international organizations, policymakers, the Agency for Reception, sponsors, all together to discuss and encourage the finding of relevant indicators for community sponsorship schemes. Now, looking forward, what we can expect And what is the future of community sponsorship in the EU? Well, first of all, we will soon have the EU guidelines on the EU approach to community sponsorship, which will highlight minimum standards for the program, and I'm sure they will also support the further promotion of a culture of community sponsorship in the EU. We have innovation. As I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, for the time being, we have seen a lot of dynamism in community sponsorship linked to mainstream resettlement and humanitarian admission. But also thanks to the EU-funded project, we see a lot of interest in university corridors, refugee labor mobility, where employers are some sort of sponsoring refugees and supporting in the welcoming of refugee workers. Another interesting point to be consider is, of course, the lessons learned from the response to the massive displacement of those fleeing the war in Ukraine. The European Commission in February 2023 awarded emergency assistance funding to the implementation of the Safe Homes project. The International Federation of the Red Cross is implementing the project in a number of member states and has provided assistance to families displaced from Ukraine, ensuring access to suitable accommodation. Both hosts and hosted people were provided support and received help to face the challenges associated with private hosting in different sessions held in the EU countries. In addition to the support to the different stakeholders involved, the project also allowed to take stock of the experience gained so far and looked at how good practices and lessons learned could be further implemented, and also fertilize the work on community sponsorship. And then, of course, one of the big challenge is to further reflect on the long-term sustainability and scalability of community sponsorship schemes, not only with regards to funding and finding a sustainable way to support civil society and grassroots organizations, but also in terms of diversifying the sponsor base and looking at innovative ways to fight the so-called sponsor fatigue and maintain that knowledge that sponsors have gained through their experience. So with this, I thank you for your attention. I hope I've thrown to you a lot of ideas and food for thought, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sara, for this extremely insightful presentation. You actually managed to put together so many different but converging elements with a very much forward-looking approach. So thank you very much indeed. And it is good to see that there are so many good practices already, but also so many projects and initiatives for the time being. So it's definitely from various perspectives, a topical and very lively topic. So we will now move to Andrea Petrakin, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Turin, in particular the Department of Cultures, Politics and Society, and also fellow at the Collegio Carlo Alberto in Turin. He has extensive experience in the area of migrants integration, and in particular, he will focus in his presentation on some of the main outcomes of an Horizon 2020 project that he has been conducting along with Professor Tiziana Caponio from the University of Turin and various other, of course, units across Europe. specifically dealing with integration policies in small and medium towns in Europe with respect to migrants. So the title of his presentation will be precisely Integration Policies and Governance in Small and Medium-Sized Towns in Europe, Insights from the COSME project, which is the project I was referring to. Thank you very much again, Andrea, for your kind availability. We agreed on a slight extension of the time allocated to you because of the absence of Leila. So please, the floor is yours for 25-30 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully it works. Can you see my PowerPoint well?
It is working on it. Still not there, but okay, we see your screen.
Not the presentation.
No, just a screen of your laptop.
Okay, so maybe I will start again. We tried it before and it worked, but now for reasons
That's
does not.
regular stuff.
I will try again now. Can you see the PowerPoint now?
Still on the... Yes, it works now. Perfect.
Okay, I will try presentation mode. Can you see it well?
Not yet. Yeah, perfect. We are on track now.
Okay, excellent. So if I can finally start, and you have already introduced the presentation. I will not present any kind of scientific paper, but rather try to give a general overview of this project called COSME, that I've had the pleasure to coordinate together with Professor Tiziana Caponio, who you have mentioned before. And as the title of the presentation suggests, and as you have also mentioned already, we focused on integration policies and governance in small and medium-sized towns in Europe, which is a very interesting topic, considering that these small localities have hosted the majority, I would say, of migrants that reached Europe in the past few years, particularly after 2014, despite them having been largely neglected by research for many years. This is an Horizon 2020 project coordinated by the Collegio Carlo Alberto. It has, as you said, partners in different countries in Europe. So I've structured my presentation around two main parts, which I've titled "What is happening on the ground and how are small localities responding to the kind of challenges related to immigrant integration." But I will first start with a kind of brief introduction of the project to just give you a sense of also the localities where we have conducted this research. So once again, the project focuses on immigrant integration, so not specifically on community sponsorship, as you will do in the COSME project, but still, of course, the issues can be related in several respects. And when I say that we focus on small and medium-sized towns, I refer to localities that have between around 10,000 to 150,000 inhabitants. We selected these localities in a very rigorous way at the beginning of the project. And these are the regions and the countries where these localities are situated. We have 7 Western European countries. And we also have a small component of the project that covered localities in Canada and in Turkey, thanks to 2 very good partners we had in these 2 countries. The project was broadly organized in 2 main parts. First, in the first part of the project, we analyzed local integration policies, targeting, and again, we also struggled with labels, targeting post-2014 migrants, again, a very general and broad label, which allowed us to cover migrants who have different legal statuses at the moment, and governance, so policies and governance. And this research was conducted in early 2022, so somehow before also the arrival of many Ukrainian refugees also in many of these localities. In the second part of the project, instead, we have been looking at integration outcomes, which we conceptualize in a very specific way, and which we intend as related, broadly speaking, to social cohesion, which is also maybe another overlap with what we will be doing in the COSME project. In other words, we have been looking at social interactions between locals and migrants in our localities, at migrants' integration experiences in these localities, and also at locals and local residents' attitudes towards migrants, towards integration, and towards integration policy. And this final part of the research has been conducted through a large N survey, which focused on 4 countries: Italy, Austria, Germany, and Sweden. So not on the 36 plus 9 localities, but rather covering the entire countries. So in my presentation, I will now start from this second part of the project. So I will reverse the order. So we'll first of all tell you something about these outcomes related to social cohesion, and then I will move back to policies and governance in the second part of the presentation. So again, what is happening on the ground? I think there are 3 main outcomes related to social cohesion that I think were particularly interesting. The first outcome is related to the fact that we observed both through qualitative research and also through the results of this survey that was conducted just a few months ago, that migrants in small localities have very, very few social interactions with long-term residents. Again, this came up from participant observations, interviews, focus groups we conducted on the ground in these localities, and also, as you can see here, from the results of this survey. We asked respondents in this survey to evaluate the relationship between refugees and long-term residents in their municipality. And as you can see here, I'm focusing on the right, on the left side of my slide. Around 86% of respondents replied that either there are no relationships, no social interactions between migrants and residents, or that there are kind of tension and hostility between these 2 groups. It is also interesting to notice that, however, there is not a lot of difference between, responses in small localities and responses in big cities. In our survey, we also covered 1,000 respondents from big cities in order to have this comparison. However, if we look at responses that concern Ukrainian refugees specifically, we can observe a lot of differences. And here, again, relations are perceived. We are, of course, talking about perceptions here as more developed and better with local residents. We introduced this component of this also comparison with Ukrainian refugees only in the second part of the project. Of course, for obvious reasons, we couldn't do that in the first part of the project. So the second important finding, I think, is related to public attitudes to immigrant integration. And here we have some quite puzzling results. On the one hand, we observed, and this is what the survey suggests, that among local residents, there is a widespread perception that migrants are not well integrated. So again, let's focus on the left side of the table. We asked our respondents to tell us whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement: in your country, refugees from outside Europe or Ukrainian refugees are well integrated, and 67% of respondents disagreed with this statement. And again, we're talking about perceptions. I repeat this several times, and it's interesting that perceptions concerning Ukrainian refugees that arrived, of course, much more recently in these localities are very different. They are perceived to be better integrated. On the other hand, and this is, I think, quite interesting, we observe that overall in small localities, as in big cities, there is a lot of support from local residents and very little opposition by local residents for more integration measures. We asked our respondents whether they thought that more integration policies, supporting non-European refugees and also Ukrainian refugees, then on a separate question, should be developed by municipalities and other kind of authorities. And the reply was, for more than 50% of respondents, that indeed there should be more integration policies developed. And only for 21% of the population, only 21% of respondents, better is to say, replied that they disagreed with this statement. This is somehow in line with results of a lot of literature on public attitudes to immigration on the one hand. On the other hand, is very much at odds with a widespread perception that we observed by interviewing local policymakers that residents are harshly hostile to migrants. So when we talked with policymakers, many of them replied that they perceived this hostility by the population towards integration measures. But again, the results of our survey suggest that this is not necessarily the case. Okay, so moving to the second part of my presentation, I'm now telling you something about the research we conducted in the first part of the project on integration policies and governance in these small localities. So how are these small localities responding? Overall, I'm starting with the kind of overall picture. We have examined policies developed by local governments in these localities in depth. We have observed the kind of relations that they developed with other actors. And the overall picture is that we observed very underdeveloped integration policies in the majority of our case localities, and very segmented or conflictual modes of governance, again, in the majority of our localities. So in the left part of this slide, you can find details about a kind of integration policy scores that have been developed by our partners, the Migration Policy Group in Brussels, which it's a kind of index of integration policy that covers, as you can see, very different aspects, in particular from policies related to anti-discrimination in the education, healthcare, housing, labor market sectors, and so on. There is, on the one hand, of course, a high, different localities developed very different policies on the one hand, but on the other hand, the overall picture suggests that policies across the various dimensions are rather underdeveloped. On the other side of the picture, you can find a very complex actually picture, which suggests a simpler message, let's say, which is again related to the segmented and conflictual nature of interactions between different actors that are involved in developing policies and responses to immigrant integration. So on the horizontal dimension, we are discussing about relations between, for instance, local governments and civil society or private actors. On the vertical dimension, we are discussing about relations between local governments and regional and national governments. These relations are overall highly segmented on the one hand, and very often conflictual, particularly on the vertical dimension. We have published an article in the journal Governance together with Tiziana Caponi if you're interested in understanding more of this very complex figure here. So the question that follows, of course, is why is this the case? Why and what are the reasons? What are the obstacles, if you want, that are preventing the development, the emergence of more developed or more inclusive responses by these local governments, by these localities as a whole in relation to migrant integration? And I think our research suggests that overall there are three key factors that are obstructing, preventing the development of more inclusive responses. And these factors, the first important factor is related to the isolation of local governments of these small localities from what we call multi-level governance structures and values. So in other words, what we did in our project was we gathered data about the kind of exchanges and interactions that local governments have with other actors involved in the governance of migration. And what came out was that there were very, very few exchanges related to immigrant integration between these local governments and, for instance, regional governments, but even more national governments, not to say EU officials or the EU level. So these localities are very rarely involved in discussions that do take place, also at the European level on immigrant integration. They also very rarely have the funds and the capacity to even apply for EU funds, to join events that take place at the national level or at the EU level. So there is a problem of capacity, and there is also a problem of the fact that probably their voices are not very much heard. This is what also many of the policymakers we interviewed suggested. They're very rarely part of also city networks on migration or immigrant integration. I think only one of our localities was somehow involved in some initiatives of this kind. So most of these interactions, exchanges on immigrant integration really take place within the localities, between the actors within the locality. And this has, of course, important implications for instance, for all the processes of policy transfer or of policy diffusion that you also mentioned, Daniela, in the first part of your presentation, and that you will also somehow maybe cover in the COSME project. If there are not exchanges between actors across localities and with higher levels of governance, it's very hard to think about dynamics and processes of policy diffusion or diffusion of best practices. Or this is at least an obstacle for the diffusion of these best practices. This is what we are arguing. The second important challenge, the second important factor that we argue is preventing the development of inclusive, let's say, responses to immigrant integration in many of our localities is related to the way in which migrant integration or responsibilities for migrant integration are understood by the actors involved in integration governance. In other words, we conducted 450 interviews with a wide range of actors involved in integration governance, let's call it like this. From public actors, bureaucrats, elected politicians, non-public actors, so from civil society, trade unions, and private actors. And we asked them this simple question, who they thought is or should be responsible for immigrant integration. And from their answers, around half of these actors somehow suggested that migrant integration is first and foremost the responsibility of migrants themselves. And at the same time, we observe, of course, a variety of different understandings of responsibilities for immigrant integration, even within the same localities sometimes. So on the one hand, this prevalence of, we call them assimilationist understandings of immigrant integration and of responsibilities for immigrant integration is, of course, constraining, and another factor that constrains the emergence of inclusive responses. And on the other hand, also the fact that very often actors have conflicting or different views on this issue, of course, is something that prevents the emergence of collaborations or has the potential to prevent the emergence of collaborations in this specific field. We're also asked, and this is part of a paper we have currently under review. This is more a scientific question, maybe. So how and why these different understandings emerge. So we are conducting, again, some analysis on this specific question. Of course, on the one hand, understandings very much vary among different actor types. Not surprisingly, civil society actors tend to use more inclusive or less assimilationist frames compared to other actors. We also try to understand whether, we have localities of different size with different kind of socio-economic contexts, with different experience with migration. We try to understand whether these factors also played a role And actually, we found that they don't, at least from the data we have. And finally, however, we do see on the one hand that the political affiliation of local executives matters. More conservative politicians use assimilationist frames or have these assimilationist understandings much more or use these frames more frequently compared to more progressive politicians. And on the other hand, also the other actors, this is what we are finding in this paper, tend to align or there is a process of convergence in understandings also of non-public actors, bureaucrats, with the understandings of these local executives. If you're interested, of course, I can share also the paper, and happy also to receive feedback since it has not been published yet. Finally, and I move really to the very final part of my presentation, a key element, a key factor that we find is really obstructing and preventing the emergence of inclusive responses for immigrant integration, related to immigrant integration, is the growing politicization of integration policymaking. So this is also maybe an aspect that, I don't know, might also emerge when looking at community sponsorship and developed in different areas, or at least it's an element that you might consider taking in mind. It's not something that we had actually really foreseen and expected when the project was written, actually, but it really, really emerged as a very, very important element. What do I mean by politicization of integration policymaking? I mean that we found that political factors, such as the political affiliation of local governments, the local presence and the local strength of anti-immigration political parties, including the number of seats that they have in local councils, and other dynamics related to local or party politics, let's say, are very much affecting policies, are very much affecting relations and collaborations among public and non-public actors, and also among actors at different levels, and also the actions, the very actions, or the propensity to develop initiatives on immigrant integration of all of these actors that are involved in immigrant integration governance. So my last slide will cover these 3 points more in depth. As to the impact on policies, and just providing you with 2 examples. On the one hand, when we interviewed around, I think, 80 policymakers, we asked them to assess the importance of different factors for their decisions to develop or not policies on immigrant integration. And the 3 most important factors that were evaluated as the most important ones by these policymakers were values and ideas, locals' attitudes towards migrants, so public opinion, which again, as we have seen before, is very much perceived as hostile to migrants by policymakers. And third, exchanges or pressure from political parties that support the local executive. This is quite surprising, and to some extent something that I'm not sure we expected to this extent. As also in research in political science and on integration policy, for many years, there was this idea that local policymakers are very pragmatic, that they tend to respond to the practical challenges of immigrant integration without being very much influenced by ideological or political factors. This is an argument that has been raised by many scholarly works in the past few years. It seems that something has possibly changed, or at least in small localities, which might be different from bigger cities that are analyzed in many of the existing works. It seems that, on the contrary, political factors, such as the ones that I've mentioned before, are really affecting decisions to develop or not integration policies. And this seems to be also having an impact in terms of the policies that are developed. This is again taken from the same index I mentioned before, developed by our partners in Brussels. The integration policies in progressive or center-left localities, or better is to say in localities with progressive or center-left local executives, are much more developed and much more inclusive compared to integration policies in more conservative localities. Maybe not surprising, but to some extent surprisingly, considering again this background that I was mentioning before. As to the impact of these political factors on governance relations, again, we have conducted a number of analyses, and what really came up is that these political factors are affecting the frequency and also the quality of interactions on immigrant integration between local governments and civil society or the private sector. So on this more horizontal dimension, interactions tend to be more frequent and more collaborative or less conflictual when local governments are progressive and when there is no anti-immigration political party represented in the local council. And on the other hand, we see that these political factors are also influencing, once again, the frequency and the kind of quality of relations, of interactions on immigrant integration between local governments and higher level governments, or regional governments in particular. So when these governments are controlled by the same parties, relations tend to be much more developed and much more collaborative, for instance. Finally, and I think I will really conclude, we have done some kind of different types of analysis, trying to understand something more about why actors, both public actors, but also, again, non-public actors or private actors, so civil society and also private actors, and their propensity to develop initiatives for migrant integration. And what we observed is that this is still something we are working on, so it's very preliminary findings, but they clearly suggest, I think, that the presence of, again, anti-immigration parties at the local level very much decreases the propensity of all these local actors to develop initiatives on immigrant integration. I think this is, I mean, there are some nuances that I'm not entering really into the details now, but if you are interested, of course, I'm also very happy to share this paper if you're interested. And again, it points towards the same direction of this politicization of integration policymaking in these small localities. This is really my last slide. So if you're interested in knowing more about what I've summarized somehow in this presentation, we do have a website, which is holcomb.eu, where you can find a lot of material that we have been on which we have been working in the past few years, a number of reports and comparative reports and again, governance policies, social cohesion, social interactions, and so on. You can find details about the results of this survey that I've mentioned in the first part of my presentation on public attitudes. We have a number of policy briefs. There will be more in the very few months of the project that are still left in front of us. We are also working on our partners, again, in Brussels in particular, are working on a policy toolbox, very practical output of this project, which is intended to provide suggestions to local governments on how to develop inclusive actions or inclusive measures on immigrant integration. And we also have a blog in case you are interested in contributing. Also, we are also very happy to receive some also contributions from non-members of the project, let's say, from external contributions. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you very much. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for this extremely fascinating presentation, which is even more fascinating for the lawyers in the room, I think. I mean, of course, we are increasingly used to multidisciplinary approaches to research, but especially for lawyers, it is still not that common to approach this kind of multi-perspective problems from these views. So very, very interesting. And also thank you for the various connections which you tried to make with the activity which we are about to start. As I said at the beginning of the meeting, I would now open the floor for some questions and comments, if any. I think we can reserve 10, maximum 15 minutes to these. So for those of you who are willing to intervene, please feel free to raise a hand or type in chat your questions and comment, if any. We have a first reservation from Cristina Milano. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. A very interesting discussion. I would like to ask a question. I don't know who can answer me. I was reading the new pact and the part of the commission where the commission encouraged the formation of an European model of community sponsorship. But the commission is quite vague about the legal basis for this European model. So I'm wondering which could be this legal basis under the treaties and under the European law. Thank you.
So we move back to the law. Thank you for this question, which is actually one that I had in mind as well. I would maybe collect other questions, if any, 2, 3 overall, and then we move to the answers. Daniela, please.
Thank you so much for this thought-provoking presentation. I would like to ask both Sara and Andrea about, what are, according to your analysis, the commonalities that could foster policy transfer at the European Union level. So from one a local entity to another. And if you identified any other thread among the different case studies you explored that could help streamline a European model of community sponsorship, or at least a model of integration, to be more broad. Thank you.
Another very interesting question. There is then a question in chat from Emilia Bertanova. Thank you so much for the interesting presentations. I have a question to Andrea. In the second quantitative part of your project, you have a comparative perspective between big and small localities. But as far as I could see, the differences were not significant. Can you please elaborate on this outcome? Thank you. And maybe since I see that also Virginia raised her hand, we can go on also with that question and then we go to the answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much for the wonderful presentation that we had so far. Very, very useful for us to think about the project and in general for understanding better this topic. So one of my questions was the Emilia question, actually. So because we do also have a focus in our project on small localities, so I wanted just to know your opinion. Andrea, does it really make sense, or maybe it's not? We have a wrong perception about the distinctive role of small cities and small local government. Then also refer to that graph, the comparison between Ukrainian and other migrants and asylum seekers. I was wondering, is your idea that racism plays a role there, and whether you had any findings about that in your project? Because this is what has been said, especially towards European institutions, right? And it's a bit, yeah, it's a bit, I could say, controversial and also concerning to see that this applies also to people on the ground, really. So yeah, it's a bit sad. And finally, a question that it kind of a bit links the two interventions to the two speakers is what we saw in recent times has been a criminalization of the activity of migration and NGOs, especially in some countries. While at the same time, we know, everybody knows, and also Andrea's project shows that NGOs do play a key role in integration. And so I was wondering whether indeed the start of this criminalization project, the criminalization attitudes have disrupted integration also, if you have seen anything, Andrea, in that sense, because we clearly saw a shift, or at least in some countries, in Italy and Greece, we saw a clear shift from one year to another, and I was wondering whether you have any insight about that. And also to Sara, I know it's a bit unfair to ask you to reply from the Commission, but at the EU level, the feeling is that something more could have been done to counteract the criminalization of these key actors for integration. And I was wondering whether you have any perspective also in that, in terms of what can be done, and whether you know that already something has been done in that sense. I know bad examples about decisions that go to other directions, but maybe surely you know more about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you for these questions. I will now leave the floor to the speakers. Maybe Sara can come first, and then Andrea, please.
Thank you very much for the very challenging questions as well. With regards to the first question on the legal basis, as I mentioned, we do not have a legal definition of community sponsorship. In the recommendation to the member states, the Commission recommendation, we refer to community sponsorship as a way to support safe and legal admission of people in need of protection. Having said that, the definition we give is more from a policy framework perspective, and the elements that will be enshrined also in the guidelines refer to this policy framework rather than a proper legal definition, putting any new rights or imposing any anything on the member states to provide kind of integration measure or so on. Then there was, I go directly to the question on criminalization, because unfortunately I cannot really provide you with an answer, as this is not my area of expertise, but I can refer you back to my colleagues and bring back the question if you want to exchange further with them. Apologies for this. And ultimately on the question on commonalities and the possibility for at the local level and the policy transfers, there are, and it was interesting to listen to you, Andrea, especially on the point where you highlighted the fact that local authorities are often not well connected with national level discussion or EU level discussion. I think there are efforts to break the silos and to encourage these exchanges. One of them being, for example, the urban agendas, where cities come together, or the European integration networks, where practitioners on integration come together to discuss common challenges. I think a few elements of commonalities where, despite the different national contexts, local policymakers could share best practice, and there is a common trend, the governance of community sponsorship. So this way of coordinating between the local, the regional, and the national level, ways to train sponsors and to recruit sponsors that can be replicated regardless of the national context, and the key elements that sponsors needs to be aware of, also with regards to them being actively in contact and first in contact with refugees, non-discrimination trainings, inclusion trainings, And then, of course, safeguards that are enshrined in the EU acquis and are, regardless of the local level, of course, replicable in all the member states and applicable in all the member states. I also take the opportunity maybe to ask Amaury if he has anything to add on the EU guidelines and how this could be also a tool for sharing best practices.
Sure, no, thank you very much for that, Sarah. Thanks for including me as well in this conversation, to the organizers. I mean, from our perspective, obviously, there are a number of risks that comes with community sponsorship and that comes with having private sponsors provide services in support of the reception and or integration of refugees. But obviously, exploitation would be one of these risks, but also the risk for private sponsors not to meet adequate standards for housing, for instance. Our message through the guideline will be to underline that the state level remains responsible and shall have systems in place to ensure that minimum standards are met, actually. I think there are also a number of other risks that we will mention in the guidelines, but more generally, the ambition really with the guidelines on the EU approach to community sponsorship, and they will be published soon. I think a date for that will be April, so in a couple of months. But the ambition for us is, well, we want to help member state practitioners to set up new schemes, actually. Also taking into consideration these risks. And so we want a practical and a hands-on products. And how to do that? By highlighting practices that have made their proofs, also by sharing the best available evidence of what works in terms of institutional setup. And I think, Sarah, you've described a bit some of the existing landscape on that point, with also explaining in various jurisdictions or various member states how coordination instruments have been put in place to ensure smooth organization of the systems of the community sponsorship schemes between all actors involved. Also, the guidelines will focus on identifying what minimum standards of quality in the reception and integration phases could ideally be put in place. And also we will list available tools because there are a number, especially a number of AMIF-funded projects who have in the last 3-4 years produced a lot of very valuable tools, guidelines, templates, etc. So that's really the ambition. And obviously, the notion of adequate standards, I think that's something, Sarah, you've referred to as well, will be also at the core of the guidelines, actually, because obviously under EU law, state authorities really bear the ultimate responsibilities for ensuring that essential socioeconomic services are met, actually. So yeah, that's the case for a number of elements, but I think the housing component, in a way, is a central element of that. So the guidelines will also refer to practical examples on how checks are being done, whether through documentary evidence, whether through in situ inspections, etc. So we hope to help disseminate best practices so as to create a robust framework for this essential aspect in particular. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Amaury, for this further insight and for outlining the possible schedule for the publication of the guidelines, which look like a very interesting document. So, Andrea, please, now the floor is yours for the answers.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the excellent and very interesting questions. I think in terms of well, I'm looking at my notes of the first question on policy transfer, and I'm sure also Petra has something to say about it as we discussed together. I think exactly this question at an event she co-organized in Brussels, I think around a year ago. But I think probably, I mean, I don't have really, of course, the answer, but we also somehow engage with this question in our policy briefs. And probably the answer is, from our perspective, related to the 3 key challenges that I outlined before. And first, so involving local policymakers more in events, in projects. Again, there are a lot of barriers for them even to apply to EU funds and to even have access to knowledge about the things that are happening at a higher level, at the higher levels, and particularly at the EU level, but also sometimes at the national level. Second, I think it's really key to make policymakers aware of their potential role. I mean, many of them, when we interviewed many policymakers, really they conveyed this idea that we are not really responsible for immigrant integration, that others should activate. And I think making them aware of what they can do also is really an important element. And finally, of course, some kind of depoliticization strategies, or however we want to call them. We provide a number of examples in, I think, one of our reports, and also I think in a policy brief, about some measures that we have also tried to test in the more applied components of our project. Moving to the second set of questions on the differences between, on the one hand, big cities and small localities, and between Ukrainians and other refugees. I think we don't have really the answer. This is really fresh data, so we only have kind of descriptive results of this survey so far, and these are the results that I have illustrated so far. We are actually working right now on a couple of papers together with our partners on really trying to understand something more about the drivers, the factors that stand behind these differences. At the descriptive level, it seems, and to some extent was surprising, to see that when we look at public opinion, we didn't really find differences between responses in small localities and in big cities. We asked a range of questions, also many questions that I didn't cover in the presentation. And the trend is that really we didn't observe a lot of differences. But again, there is need for more sophisticated analysis in order to really have a more complete answer to this question. And also concerning Ukrainians, the differences are very evident, and at the descriptive level, they are really, really big. I don't really have an answer yet about why we observe these differences. So hopefully in a few months, we will have some answers on this. While of course, the differences in terms of policies and in terms of governance between big cities and small localities are very, very evident in terms of also the size of the kind of administrative apparatus, the fact that there are in big cities for sure officials and also members of the local executive that are specifically responsible for immigrant integration. This is something that certainly makes the difference. These are not present in the vast majority of the localities we have been observing. And finally, question on the criminalization of NGOs. I don't have an answer in terms of kind of differences and whether these impacted integration policies or integration processes. So this, I think, is an open question and a very interesting question. Of course, what I can say is that we really observed a lot of tensions. And again, we also gathered more quantitative and also qualitative data on these kind of interactions. And we really perceived a lot of tensions also at the local level between civil society actors and local governments. And again, at least from what we know from also the studies that have been done on this issue in previous years, this is something relatively unexpected, or the extent to which we observed these kind of tensions was a bit surprising. And I'll stop here. But again, thank you very much for the super interesting questions.
Thank you, Andrea, also for these further comments. I will now to Petra, just to avoid the risk of running out of time, so that also after her conclusions we might have some minutes for reactions from the audience, if any. Petra has already been mentioned somehow by Sara, for the very simple reason she's probably one of the main experts in Europe in community sponsorship and related areas. She's former head of ICMC Europe, and now she's independent advisor in resettlement, community pathways, and local integration. We asked her to conclude these meetings also in the light of her day-by-day experience and expertise. So please, Petra, the floor is yours, and thank you again for being so kind as to accept our invitation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefano, and the colleagues from Bologna and from Torino and Tuscia to have me for this Friday afternoon reflection, which is always a challenging moment because the weekend is approaching. So you may have your head already thinking about other things, but okay, let's still give some reflections. As Stefano said, I have been working for a long time in both resettlement, complementary pathways, and local integration. Working in this fascinating area that has developed since 2013, so we're about 10 years on the road to looking at this experience of community sponsorship. Looking originally at the Canadian experience, and then I remember when I said, well, we have to really look at this, we have to look at citizens and engagement. Citizens have a role to play as a partner in hosting refugees and in integration. And then everyone's saying, well, I mean, we are not Canada. We have the state, we have our social welfare state. So this is a role of the state, and it's not a role of citizens and of local communities. But indeed, that has been shifting, that this discussion has been shifting, and also the understanding about community sponsorship has been shifting a lot. And therefore, I congratulate the European Asylum Agency to try to make some structure out of this complicated process, which is very dependent on the local context and on the national context on how to deal with admissions. We have been looking a lot at the SHARE network. I think Sarah was already talking about communities of practice and how these are developing across varied national and regional context. So I really would advise you to have a look at the SHARE network website. There are a lot of practices there. We have about 4,500. I still say we but I'm no longer directing the office, but my colleagues are doing that and in a very efficient and participative manner. So have a look at the SHARE website and look how you can find inspirations. But going back to because I think it's difficult to structure this discussion on sponsorship, because as Sarah was already saying, and Anne-Marie was confirming, that there is not a defined definition. And I must say, when we started, I was really very convinced that we needed to have this definition. But across the line, I thought, well, I mean, for different groups to take ownership of the concept of community hosting, is it then necessary to have this definition that will maybe also avoid flexibility? On the other hand, it sometimes creates a bit of confusion, because in each context, people take ownership of the concept and interpret it in a very different way and fly with it. But okay, so let's go back in this sort of structuring of community sponsorship. So on the one hand, it is a tool to provide third country solutions that can be within the refugee resettlement framework. So that is where we have sponsorship programs in Ireland, in Germany, in Spain, and in Belgium. It can be a complementary pathway. It can be also within resettlement, can be additional. So we can achieve in receiving a higher number of refugees coming to Europe in a safe and legal manner. Being a complementary pathways, it can be additional. So there we talk about the humanitarian corridors in France and in Italy, but also in other complementary pathways like higher education programs, family reunification under humanitarian admission. And now really coming up is labor mobility, where, for example, in the UK, local communities will be supporting people coming under employment programs. So it's a tool to provide third country solution if it's a complementary pathways in really sort of having numbers coming to Europe under that programs. And of course, it's a welcoming and integration tool. So it supports, it can support resettlement and other models. And in that respect, it has a very strong community aspect. But of course, the leadership is very fragmented and very diverse, and there is not really one way of doing it. This fragmentation, and also, of course, we have seen with Ukraine and also with Afghanistan that if we keep to certain very defined concept of legal pathways, you lose out that in the end's essence, communities are supporting arrival refugees, which gives, of course, then also different ways of looking at the objective, and also conflicts between different parties. Governments will have a different objective than some civil society groups. For a government, it can be, we want to solve the housing problem first of all, and civil society and sponsorship can really help us to support that objective. While we also have another way of looking at sponsorship. And frankly, I see that very often because Europe is a very big place and there's so many things happening in local communities that it's difficult to keep track of it. But there are also many groups that see it as a framework beyond refugee admissions from third countries and look at it much more holistically to support the welcome of all types of newcomers. Whether they're refugees, whether they're asylum seekers, whether they're migrants, unaccompanied minors. So they see, well, this is a community tool that helps us to address this increasingly complicated, polarized migration context where extreme right parties are on the rise, and it gives us a way to do something and shape our futures or Europe's futures. And there you have also groups that have completely different ways of looking at it, or they also look at it in a context of relocation, or it's different ways. So that is complicated, because if you talk to people, they will have a very different way of understanding what sponsorships are. Governments also, like I said, have different objectives, because we're talking here about division of roles and responsibilities. Is it the state that has the responsibility? And in terms of third country nationals, the state has responsibilities for receptions. We have a very clear framework. So, and if you let go of that control, where will it end? And Omari was already saying we have to talk about quality standards. I mean, you don't know what people will be doing with people that they have under their in their families or in their communities. We have never had the discussion with resettlement because there it's understood that the state has this responsibility of ensuring reception and integration. And we consider that the state does that well without abuse. But the moment we talk about, of course, but they have the responsibility. And if we talk about citizens, that is, of course, much more complex. States can always also say, well, we have, this is the responsibility of the state, but what we would like is that citizens will help with the integration. For example, in Sweden, they talk about sponsorship and they say, well, we have a sort of buddy program. It can be for asylum seekers. They don't really discuss it very much, but it gives people an opportunity to step in. I don't want to talk very long, but can I still have 5 minutes, Stefano?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So what I think that we should not forget is that sponsorships are seeing as a way forward in shaping positive narratives around migration. But of course, if we now talk about the upcoming guidelines for the European Asylum Agency, it will be very much to look at sponsorship as a tool in the context of refugee admissions, which is how sponsorship have been developed. And then we talk about pairing of refugees and persons being admitted under a sentiment and complementary pathways with individuals, groups, or organizations in their communities to support their integration. What we can say as well, that there is, of course, a big disagreement on how to divide these responsibilities, and that makes it also very complex on how to further build on scaling up sponsorships. Some countries will limit the role of sponsorship, and they say, okay, you limit to reception and integration and on providing housing, like I said. And other countries say, well, civil society groups can do much more, like in the humanitarian corridors. They can identify refugees themselves. They can select varied refugee groups. They can, for example, have a program for LGBTQ refugees and have a very targeted program for that. And they can start student programs or other programs. So not each government is having the same view on that. And of course, in the end, that will depend in the end, of course, on the governments, but also on advocacy from civil society organizations, often church-based groups, and building confidence that they can do that in a good manner. In a very responsible manner. And that's why also these programs to share knowledge on minimum standards, on quality, on safeguarding are extremely important. What is a challenge, and then we talked about the multi-level governance, which is an important part of your project, is, of course, that the sharing of responsibility between different levels, between government, regional, local, and civil society is very diverse. In any case, it requires an enormous amount of coordination and planning if you talk about arrivals. People will be selected in a third country, they have to arrive, it can take up to several months, and then you have to have your partnerships in place. That gives a lot of, it's a very big puzzle to make that work and make sure that the housing will be there, that volunteers are in place, etc. That is why, for example, with the Ukrainian experience, that was much easier for citizens to respond because they didn't have to take care of that part. They were arriving in the communities and they could organize in a relatively flexible manner without very detailed roles and responsibilities. The idea was that people could step in, they could provide housing for a minimum period of time. So it's very light. They called it also sponsorship light. There's also quite a lot of potential in decentralized programs, and I don't know, I think Sarah, was it you that talked about the program, the Basque Country, where certain regions in Spain said, well, we want to be part of this. We want to do more. We think that we have a role to play in international solidarity. And they defined decentralized programs, although they were talking about refugees identified and referred by UNHCR and admitted by the Spanish government. They developed their program very, very local, which I think is a great asset because they could really look at the local resources and, for example, also at the local integration context. Andrea was talking about rural programs, And we have seen that also in France and Italy, these rural programs offered the community the opportunity to be creative. They had they took agency of these programs. They said, well, we are losing people, and the demographics are going the bad way. We are losing population. We want to keep our schools open. We want to show also that we are not are areas that cannot develop, that are not socially innovative. And they developed programs that were very creative in hosting refugees. So there are many different ways of doing it. But in the end, of course, this multi-level governance context is something that always has to be addressed. What we have been thinking ourselves is that you could do, in terms of experience sharing, have much more sub-communities of practice. For example, you could have in big cities, you can look much more at different housing arrangements. How can you open up housing that has not that has become available in smaller municipalities? Where you can maybe split, because what we have seen also, and that is very an important thing to take into account, that many populations say, well, we want to do something, but we cannot do everything. We are facing inflation. We have ourselves a lot of things to handle. Resources are more limited. So that you really look at a better sharing of who is doing what for how long in what area, which is very complex. I don't know if someone has seen the MPG publication on the end of, what is it called? Humanitarian fatigue. What was it again? I'm just looking at how it was called. It talks about the fact that certain communities become really tired of always have to deal with increasing numbers, and that it's always the same, and that this is a big issue if you want to sustain engagement of citizens for the longer term. So it is also very important that you have a broad basis of different actors that take up a role, and that indeed you keep a very close connection to the state system and make sure that is not it's not replacing the state system. For me, I can talk about this issue for hours, of course, and it's always complex. What I think is important for this discussion, and particularly because you're doing your research, is try to make things very, very sort of specific and contextualized, because in the end, we're always trying to compare apples with pears. And that is sometimes very dangerous. Because the same thing you don't have the same status, you don't have. So whether you look at an integration program, if you see sponsorship is an integration program, is this then a model that would apply to all newcomers? Or do we say, no, we talk about sponsorship in this context of people coming from in the context of resettlement and complementary pathways? For local communities is my experience, and I will stop with that. Andrea was already said it, we had a very interesting program working in 6 countries in a rural context. If you go to the community, they really do not care. They don't understand all these differences. For them, they have newcomers arriving. They want to deal with it. They want to make it happen. They don't have the resources to have one person for this status and the other for the other status. So they really want to have, like we say, inclusive territories that can provide futures. They can be long-term futures. It can be a short period. It can be transitional. So flexibility is very important, but of course, if you link sponsorship very much to local welcome, then you have to be very flexible and see it also in the context of how that community responds to all people, to their local citizens, because you cannot have a system in the end that is being providing more to the newcomers and doesn't take account of the local people that are being there. And there you have to have really much more local inclusion, social cohesion directed programs. I think this is a bit much for the Friday afternoon. It was just some food for thoughts, and I'm happy that I had the opportunity to see new people that are being engaged in this very fantastic, fascinating issue. So thank you very much and have a nice weekend.
Thank you, Petra, from all of us, from all the participants, I would say. And thank you for pointing at some keywords that are very important, not only in theory, but also in practice. So flexibility, specificity, fatigue as well, another word that has been mentioned by Sarah in her presentation. From a research perspective, we'll definitely have to take these elements into account very carefully. But I would say that in general, they are quite resounding keywords also for other parallel areas or of EU migration law. If anyone thinks of his own community and his own experience, so very enlightening to some extent. We still have 3 minutes. No, I mean, in case we have very last minute questions or final comments from any of the participants. Otherwise, we pack all the food for thought we have gathered so far, and we'll keep it for other meetings. Daniela, please.
Thank you, Stefano. Just a final word to thank all the participants again. And the audience was really fruitful, especially for us. We are just starting with the COSME project, and in conclusion, I mean, it's more clear the number of challenges we will have to face in the next months. Of course, we will keep trying to respond to a very key question, which is about the contribution, the potential contribution of developing a normative understanding of community sponsorship at the interface between the EU policies on the integration of third country nationals on the one end, and the future EU framework on resettlement and other legal protection pathways on the other. And it would be very interesting also to see whether the development of community sponsorship could help categorizing human mobility as a collective transnational responsibility, and as such distinguish it from migration management. So this is more or less what we will try to do, and I am extremely grateful to all the participants for their contribution. I look forward to meeting you soon in the next workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Just a very final thank to the speakers, to the participants. Yeah, Peter, please.
Stefano,
Yeah.
I completely forgot to tell the audience for your next steps, of course, in this program, which will be a workshop that you will be organizing in the months of May, no? Maybe you can add to that.
Yes, thank you so much. It's going to be a hybrid workshop based in Viterbo, but also with online, with the possibility to follow online. And it's going to be about resilience and contribution of communities, also academic communities and more general local communities. but more information will be provided through the website, which will be operational in the next weeks. Thank you so much, Petra, for reminding this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Daniela, do you want to put the website in the chat maybe?
I guess we will, send an email to everybody to share the address. Thank you so much.
So it's 5 p.m. I've never found such a timely meeting in terms of conclusion. Again, thank you very much and hope to see you soon somewhere in Europe, either in person or online. All the best.
Thank
Bye
you so
bye.
much.
Have a nice
Bye.
weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Have a nice weekend.
Bye.